This is Have You Met? My guest today is a renowned journalist and author. For most of his career, he wrote for the New York Times. He's well known for being part of a small team to publish a 2017 article that changed the conversation on UFOs. He's written several books, both fiction and non-fiction. His most recent publication is a biography of the late great Dr. John Mack, titled The Believer: Alien Encounters, Hard Science, and the Passion of John Mack. John Mack was an eminent Harvard psychiatrist who developed an interest in the alien abduction phenomenon. He risked his career and reputation to try to find out as much as he could about it. Have you met Ralph Blumenthal? So, Ralph, obviously I want to get to John Mack and talking about your book, but you've had a fascinating career yourself. So if we could go back to how you got into journalism and how your career took shape, and just any moments you want to touch on, that would be awesome if you could give me that.
Well, I got into journalism at a great time when print was still king, and I had been the editor of my college newspaper, City College of New York, and went on to Columbia Journalism School, which was and still is the premier journalism school. And after that, I got a job at the New York Times as a copy boy, which is the lowest of the low. You get coffee for people, you carry their stories to the editors, do whatever they want. But it was a great, window into the New York Times. It was wonderful to be there. There were giants in the field then, as there are now, but it was just a wonderful time to be there. And of course, it was the age of typewriters, and it was a previous, era, antediluvian in many ways, a dinosaur era. But I learned a tremendous amount from watching the experts at work, and I made my way up the ladder from suburban correspondent. I was a foreign correspondent in Vietnam and Cambodia and West Germany, and then I came back and started covering law enforcement and politics and a lot of investigative reporting into political corruption. I did a lot of reporting on Nazi war criminals hiding in America, broke the story of the fact that the CIA had provided access into America for a lot of war criminals and Nazi scientists because we wanted to use their expertise. Very shameful story. Then I was a national correspondent in Texas, where the John Mack story sort of comes in. We can talk about later. And I was a cultural reporter for a while, covering the opera and classical music and Broadway, which was a wonderful change from political corruption.
Yeah.
All good news. Then I left the Times after 45 years in 2009 to freelance to work on my book on John Mack and, do other projects and also teach. I became a distinguished lecturer at Baruch College of the City University of New York, where I still am, working in the library archives, in charge of certain historical collections on reform government. But I still contribute to the Times, and I follow the UFO story. So that takes us up to the present.
Yeah. Wow. Quite a summary. Yeah. Amazing career you've had.
I had fun, and as I tell my journalism students, it is a wonderful career to be a journalist because you get to travel everywhere, meet all kinds of interesting people. It's never a dull moment. Of course, the downside is every day you start from zero, and you have to fill those pages or the web. So it's not easy, especially today. But it's still a wonderful career.
Yeah, and it's your job to learn, I suppose. So yeah, you're always learning new things. But you've also been a writer as well.
Make yourself an expert in everything, and it is very challenging, especially today, where you could be caught out on anything. If you get anything wrong, there's a million people out there who will tell you that. So it's
if they're wrong.
It's a wonderful life.
Yeah. Amazing. And you've also, like I just mentioned, written novels, and you've written nonfiction as well.
Nonfiction. I wrote a book about the mafia and a big drug case, the Pizza Connection, which actually a National Geographic program is going to feature starting later this month.
Cool.
National Geographic is doing a whole season of mafia stories, so I'll be on that.
Yeah.
And so I wrote about cops. I wrote about the famous nightclub in New York, the Stork Club, which is probably the most famous night spot where all the celebrities gathered after World War II, after Prohibition originally. So, I had a good run with books.
Yeah, Miracle at Sing Sing is one I definitely want to get to as well in my own time at some point.
Yeah,
That
well,
seems
writing
awesome.
about law enforcement, I got to interested in the question of prison and penology, and warden of Sing Sing at the time, Warden Laws. They were a great name for a warden.
Yeah.
There are people who think that names determine history. There's something to that. Anyway, he went into penology and became a great prison reformer. And he, even though he had to preside over 300 executions in the electric chair at Sing Sing, he was a great opponent of capital punishment because he saw it didn't do any good. It didn't deter anybody. It certainly didn't help, bring back to life any of the people who were killed, and it didn't allow for the rehabilitation of people. And often they got the defendant wrong. He didn't do it. So they executed the wrong people. Anyway, so that I was very proud of that book.
Yeah, absolutely. So along that winding road of fascinating twists and turns, at what point did UFOs/UAPs first kind of raise their head and grab your interest?
Right. Well, like a lot of people in my generation, growing up, right after the war, World War II, for people who don't know that that's the term, the war. I got interested in science fiction. That was a big thing at the time. Ray Bradbury, Isaac Asimov, all the great writers, masters of science fiction. So I, gobbled that up like everybody else in my generation. And then it kind of wore off. I moved on to other things. I got interested in journalism. So I really didn't do anything in that line until I was the New York Times correspondent in Texas starting in 2003. And in 2004, I picked up a copy of a used book that I knew nothing about. It was called Passport to the Cosmos by John Mack. It was his second book. And I thought that it's really an interesting idea that a Harvard psychiatrist, a very renowned in his field, he had written a Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, and he was esteemed in his profession at Harvard as a professor of psychiatry. I got interested in the whole idea of alien abduction and people who had these experiences, or who talked about the experiences of encountering alien beings. So he'd written 2 books. I picked up the second one. As I said, I knew nothing about him, even though he was quite famous at the time already. He'd won the Pulitzer for Lawrence. He had been interviewed on the Oprah Winfrey Show. He'd been in the New York Times many times, which I skipped over completely, given a lot of lectures. He'd been investigated by Harvard for his methods, eventually cleared, basically. So in other words, he had all this history that I knew nothing about. So I decided, based on this book, I was going to give him a call and see if I could interview him. Very interesting character, the Harvard connection, etc., aliens. And the next thing I knew, I picked up the paper and he was dead. He'd been run over in London. He'd been there for a conference on Lawrence, looked the wrong way, as we Yanks do in the UK, and it got mowed down by a guy who'd had too much to drink. So, of course, the first rumor that spread instantly was that he'd been assassinated because he was too troublesome to Harvard. And I was able to basically debunk that conclusively, in my opinion, with the police reports. It was a complete accident. But to that. So anyway, so that got me started, and I got in touch with the family, who were grieving at that point and didn't want to talk about, his materials. But eventually I got access to all his archives, his journals, his writings, his tapes of his own therapy sessions, very intimate things, his emails, girlfriends, wife, etc. And that got me started. And I spent the next 16 years researching the story of John Mack. And now the book has come out.
Wow. 16 years just engrossed in this level of access. Yeah. You must feel like you know John Mack so well now, even though did you ever meet him? I
never did, because as I said, he'd been run over when I was in Texas for the New York Times, so I had never met him before then, and then it was too late. But it was engrossing. I was very privileged as a biographer to have access to all these materials that writers always wish they could have. So I had the full cooperation of his family, even though they did not demand any preconditions. They didn't see the manuscript as I was writing about it. They didn't direct it in any way. It was not, quote, authorized. But I had full cooperation of his wife, Sally, who died shortly afterwards of cancer, and his friends and colleagues. Everybody was very forthcoming with me. So that made it easier, but it was a huge task to go through all his material, because he accumulated so much.
Yeah, I have no doubt. I mean, from reading the book, I can just begin to imagine the extent of the stuff you must have gone through. Like this must be a tiny percentage of the kind of stuff you've sifted through and combed through.
Right. A lot of it, I couldn't use in the book. It was just too much. I think I got the important parts. He lived an amazing life as a scholar and a professor, and very wide-ranging, because after alien abduction, before alien abduction, he was on to many interesting things, which you can talk about. And after alien abduction, he was on to other interesting things. Yeah. So it really was a full life he led.
Yeah, no, I'm really interested by basically all of the things he was interested in at the moment. I've kind of had this, I guess, since we've all been locked away and things like that, I've had more time to think about things and look at things. And he was interested in just the most fascinating subjects that we have available, really, in a way, wasn't he? Like everything from nightmares and that kind of thing, and just general psychiatry, all the way through to the abductions and life after death, survival of consciousness.
Reaching out, and he was not constrained in his interests. I mean, he started off doing basically social reform, bringing psychiatric services, mental health services to poor areas of Boston, Cambridge, and got involved in campaign against nuclear weapons, to outlaw nuclear weapons. He got arrested at the Nevada test site with his family protesting nuclear weapons. And he got very interested in the Middle East because of his Lawrence book. So he went over there to meet with Palestinian colleagues and try to understand the roots of the Arab-Israeli conflict, very timely today. He met with Yasser Arafat. So he was wide-ranging. And then after, when he got interested in alien abduction, which we'll talk about how that happened, he continued on to other anomalous areas. He got very interested in crop circles. He went to England to investigate those in Wiltshire. And he got interested eventually in life after death and the survival of consciousness, which was very much on his mind at the time when he was run over. So there was a lot to his life.
Yeah, very colorful character, like indeed. And the interest, I do want to circle back to life after death and survival of consciousness and that kind of stuff in a little bit, because I know one of your colleagues at the New York Times has written a book on that as well, that's Surviving Death on Netflix. And I watched that recently as well, and I found I was gripped by that a couple of months ago. It was just completely eye-opening, I was always kind of, or recently I've been fairly open-minded, but honestly, when my girlfriend said, should we watch this, and showed me what the episodes were called, and I was definitely skeptical, but it's something. It's hard to, you can't watch it and just say rubbish. It's too much there to just dismiss it out of hand.
It is in many ways like the whole alien encounter field. That the more you know about it, the more intriguing it becomes. And the people who are renowned as, debunkers or so-called skeptics aren't really skeptics because they don't have an open mind. They just say what you just said. Oh, it's rubbish. And these people are crazy and they don't know what they're talking about because the people are not mentally ill. They are not looking for publicity. On the contrary, they're running away from attention. They feel ashamed of what they have been, part of. They don't understand it. It is one of those areas that you really have to do the research to understand more of before you pronounce on it one way or the other.
Yeah. And on the abductions, I mean, obviously we can go into in just a moment, like how John got into that. I mean, I know it's to do with Bud Hopkins and all that kind of thing, but you can jump into that whole story in a moment. But yeah, it's just one of those topics where even if, like, I'm not necessarily the cleverest guy in any room or anything like that, but you have to have a certain level of intelligence to understand, okay, John Mack was very clever. And if he's thinking this is something that needs to be looked at closer and we can't just look at it black and white and say, okay, that's what's happening.
Ben, he was brilliant. That's true, but he was not arrogant about it. No. I mean, let me amend that. There was a bit of arrogance about it because he knew he was brilliant, but he was very patient in explaining it to different audiences. He was willing to go into the lion's den at Harvard and other places and take on skeptical audiences and try to win them over. So he was very willing to do the work and to face ridicule and shame and derision. So that's an interesting aspect of him. He was very patient in a way.
Mm. Yeah. So go on then. Give me the brief little intro, kind of a brief summary of how John Mack, this highly respected, distinguished Harvard professor specializing in psychiatry and doctor, how he all of a sudden had his eyes opened or interest, grabbed by abduction experiences, I suppose.
Right. Yeah, they like the word experiencers because it's more neutral than abductees. Abductees kind of already assumes the experience. Well, as I lay out my book, which by the way is called The Believer, Alien Encounters, Hard Science, and the Passion of John Mack, I lay out the steps that led John Mack to the whole field of alien abduction. And this is what happened. As I said, he was doing all these other things, protesting nuclear weapons, involved in social causes, Middle East peace efforts, which grew out of his book on Lawrence. And then he went out to Esalen, which is that think tank on the Pacific where a lot of psychic experiments and research was going on into LSD and so a lot of cutting edge psychiatry. And interesting story about Esalen, which I touch on in my book. Anyway, he went out there and a fellow psychiatrist from Czechoslovakia named Stan Grof, who's quite famous in his own way, handed him a book about called Spiritual Emergency, about different psychic states of anxiety and emergency. And one of the chapters was about alien encounters. And Mack read that, and he was very dubious. He thought it didn't make a lot of sense to him that humans could actually be encountering alien beings, but it planted the idea in his mind. And then he got very interested in something called holotropic breathing that Stan Grof was researching at the time. It was a relaxation method, like hypnosis in a way, but it was basically self-relaxation to music. And through that, people could enter altered states of consciousness, sometimes going back to a previous life, it seemed, remembering what life was like in the womb, remembering being born, all through this relaxation technique. So John Mack tried that, and he was very taken with it because it did take him back to his childhood, his pre-childhood, his before he was born in the womb, struggling to be born, he had a vision of a past life in Russia. And he thought, wow, this opened his psyche, his boundaries, to see that there was more to, existence than this three-dimensional world that we are all assuming is reality. Mm. And at one of these breathwork sessions, conferences, he met a fellow psychiatrist who told him about Bud Hopkins. And Bud Hopkins was an artist in New York and Cape Cod who had a sighting of a UFO and got very interested in UFOs and started interviewing people with abduction stories. And he wrote some of the first books about it, including a book called Missing Time, about people who lose consciousness and then only later recover a memory of what happened to them. They were abducted or they had an encounter with aliens. Anyway, it was a phenomenon really not recognized until that point, and Bud Hopkins wrote about it. And John Mack got an introduction to Bud Hopkins, which he didn't want to take up at first because he thought it sounded too crazy. And he thought Bud Hopkins must be crazy, and the people who had all these so-called experiences had to be crazy. But as life would have it, strange things. He found himself in New York, and he found himself calling Bud Hopkins, and I sort of tell the story in the book. It's more detailed. And went to see Bud Hopkins, and Bud Hopkins gave him a bunch of letters from people who had read his book, Bud's book, and were reporting their own encounter experiences, abduction experiences, and gave them to John Mack to look at. He said, "You're the psychiatrist. You look at these letters and decide what's going on with these people." So John Mack did that. He took the letters, and he had other things to do, so he didn't immediately go through them, but shortly afterwards he did, and he was astounded that there could be anything like this. That the people who he quickly discovered were ordinary people, not mentally ill. They were not following any mass delusion or agenda. And, we can explore that later in a little more detail, why he thought they were normal. But anyway, they all had basically a similar story, how they were, saw a UFO, they saw these beings, they were beamed into a craft or a ship, all kinds of tests or experiments, including reproductive procedures, taking eggs from women and sperm from men, apparently to create a hybrid race, and then they would be re-abducted later to see their hybrid children. And these are the stories, not all consistent 100%, but the basic story that people were telling. So that's what got him started. And he collected his own group of these experiencers, as he called them, and explored their stories. And he ended up writing the first book called Abduction, and then the book that I picked up in Texas, Passport to the Cosmos, where he explored these experiences from the standpoint of a psychiatrist in great detail. And this was his advantage, of course, because he was a trained psychiatrist. And other people like Bud Hopkins, as enthusiastic as they were, could not bring that same level of expertise and knowledge, scholarship, and professional, expertise to the field, and he could. So that's, that got him into the field. He started studying it, and he quickly became convinced he was onto something.
Yeah, it's an amazing story. Before, obviously, eventually he had the run-in with Harvard, and they put him on, in essence, on trial, basically. Before that, do you have much kind of idea from reading through all of his stuff, how much resistance he faced, like in the early days, or did he keep it all very private from the outside world?
Surprisingly, Ben, he didn't keep it private. Almost as soon as he learned about it from Bud Hopkins, he started thinking about talking about what he learned. And in the book, I suggest it might have been a little too soon. He didn't take enough time to really study the phenomenon before he started talking about it. But that was his style. He was very impetuous, very passionate, and he wanted to tell the world what he had found. And he was really one of the few. Other psychiatrists had encountered this in terms of patients who told them stories, but by and large, they wrote it off as a delusion. They didn't want to deal with it. They said, you must be dreaming, must be a nightmare or whatever. But as soon as he heard about it and looked into it, he decided it was something real about it. And we can talk about what dimension this was playing out in, but that it sounded real to him because the way the people talked about it afterwards, they were very emotionally overwrought when they discussed their experience. So so he began talking about it, and he talked about it to a faculty club at Harvard very quickly. I mean, within a year, let's say. And then he convened a grand rounds, which is a lecture at Harvard in December 91. So less than 2 years after he first heard about it from Bud Hopkins. Where he laid it out, and he actually brought an experiencer to talk to the audience. He brought an experiencer to talk to the audience, and he brought a tape of a session he had done with an experiencer of a woman who remembered having her pregnancy removed, on a spaceship by aliens in this hybrid breeding program, supposedly. And she was crying and weeping, and it was a harrowing tape to listen to. So he did start talking about it right away, and he wasn't intimidated. And quite a number of colleagues thought he was out of his mind. He encountered quite a bit of resistance. He was written off as, he'd gone over the hill, over the wall. But there were others, especially people who had experienced this, who knew what they recognized what he was talking about. They recognized themselves, and they came to his defense. And other colleagues defended his methods and said he was just following, evidence, anecdotal evidence. There was no real proof, but he was still, using time-tested scientific methods of interviewing people and trying to understand what had happened to them and applying his skills to analyze it. And if you read his first book, particularly, you see the rigor that he took to test their stories and to understand what was going on and why he rejected all the other explanations. So anyway, to answer your question, a long roundabout way, he had quite a bit of opposition. He had some support, and he was undeterred. He just started talking about it, and that certainly picked up as the years went on.
Yeah, it's amazing. You're a pioneer, just like you say, following from as far as he can see the best available. It's a weird word to use it, but evidence. Like you say, it's anecdotal, it's witness, but it's an evidence of sorts, isn't it? So most people listening, or some people listening at least, are going to be thinking, yeah, somebody says they went up to the spaceship and this X, Y, and Z happened to them. That's a weird dream, or it's a nightmare, or it's to do with sleep paralysis or hallucination. People can come up with anything to say something easier to accept, I suppose. But how did John kind of differentiate the fact that these people that he was seeing and that he was dealing with were, like you said earlier, in essence normal, although there is no normal for human, is there? But as close as can be.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell a little story that I start my book with. There was a renowned English scientist of the 1870s named Sir William Crookes, Crookes, who was quite a eminent scientist in his own way. And he, at that time, there was a great interest in seances and paranormal, activities. And he was sent by his scientific society to attend one of these seances and debunk it. So he went, and he was amazed to see these things happening, musical instruments playing themselves in a locked cabinet, and people levitating, and protoplasm emerging at a seance. And instead of debunking it, he came back and he said something very famous, which I use as sort of an epigraph in my book. I never said it was possible. I only said it was true. So if you forget for a moment whether a certain thing is possible or not, and everybody agrees that these things are not possible in our reality,
A worldview.
they make no sense. We don't see it happening in the street. It goes against every idea we have about, how things work in reality. Anyway, so John and everybody else agreed these things were not possible, and yet the stories that the experiences were telling him, and other quote evidence, as you say, that he collected, showed otherwise. That something was happening that ran counter to what everybody believed was possible. So first of all, the stories were basically consistent, that people from all different walks of life, men and women, blue-collar people, professionals, police officers, doctors, psychiatrists, business people, didn't matter. We're basically telling the same stories of seeing a UFO and then feeling the presence of these alien beings. And children who he talked to too, John Mack, as young as 2 years old, would tell these stories, little man, take me up into the sky, I fly in the sky. And, John Mack realized that these children were not quoting from books they had read. They couldn't read. They didn't go to the movies. So they weren't making it up based on, some cultural, background they had. Anyway, so the stories were basically consistent, and yet there were so many details that were completely strange and different, that the people couldn't be reciting some story that they had all heard or read about. The stories were so insane, really weird, that you'd say they couldn't be made up. No one could even think of these things. So that was one thing he noticed. Secondly, he noticed that these things didn't happen only at night when people were supposedly sleeping or having nightmares. They happened in some cases during the day. People walking around, a woman on a snowmobile in one case was driving a snowmobile, people driving their cars. And when they occurred at night, they weren't necessarily nightmares, because the people themselves differentiated between what was a nightmare and what was really happening to them, or what they felt was really happening to them. And among other things, John Mack was an expert in nightmares because he had written a book on nightmares and he had done a scholarly study of nightmares. So people, skeptics couldn't say, oh, you don't understand, John, these are nightmares. He knew what nightmares were. And people felt, as I said, the difference between waking up out of a nightmare or being fully awake and seeing their doors sliding open and a being, short, gray, robotic being walking in. So that was another thing. There was some quote evidence to the extent of scars and scoop marks afterwards that people could not remember ever getting before from any operation, but they saw these marks on their bodies afterwards that seemed relatable to some experiments or tests that they had been subjected to on the craft. Sometimes the grass was pressed down or foliage was disturbed outside where they remembered a UFO had landed. And in some cases, there were even corroborative witnesses, which is perhaps the most striking aspect of this. There was a case he wrote about of two girls who had a sleepover, and outside they remembered seeing a UFO. Later they described this. Anyway, they had this sleepover. The mother of one of the girls where the sleepover was happening came down to check on them during the night and found them missing. So she completely panicked, called the police. They searched everywhere and they didn't find them. And a few hours later, the girls turned up in their beds. And later, they recounted, they recaptured in maybe a hypnotic regression, I believe, this missing time where they said they saw the UFO landing outside and they were taken away in the spaceship for a few hours and then returned. So in this case, there was the corroborative evidence of the mother who said, I went down to look for the girls, and they were gone. So this was an actual case of physical absence, which is not always the case, because there are also examples of people who feel themselves present. So in other cases, it seems to be a psychic phenomena where the spirit or the soul or the non-corporeal part of the body, is abducted or taken away. And very complicated stuff. Anyway, so you asked, what were the things that convinced John Mack that these stories are real? And then, as I said, the affect, which is a psychiatric term for the way people present these stories, was very convincing to him. They were not making it up, thinking of things to say. They were completely caught up in the moment, and they were weeping and crying and cursing and yelling, and they seemed to be undergoing that experience of having a pregnancy removed or encountering these beings, terrified. So again, he said, this does not sound like something people would be making up as they go along. And he had his psychiatric, training to back him up. He had studied all this stuff.
Yeah.
So
it's something.
It's answer to why John Mack believed he was onto something.
Yeah, absolutely. Because he had no reason to think he wasn't, other than the prevailing worldview, I guess.
Listen, he said to the so-called skeptics, if you have an explanation that accounts for all these things I just laid out, why children as young as 2, and why the stories are consistent, and the individual details, and the damaged foliage outside, and the witness corroboration, if you can give me a theory that ticks off all these boxes, I'll buy it. But he kept saying there was nothing to indicate that anything had happened other than what the people said had happened, even though it seems impossible.
Yeah, I feel like these days, well, not even just these days, it's clearly been happening for a long time, but we struggle to take people at their word when it's something that doesn't sound just conventional,
we're all brought up to understand this physical world, and it looks like reality to us. And we take it as the only reality there is. And then we find out about things like, love and God and, near-death experiences that seem to challenge our idea of what reality is. So this has been a constant, motif in culture, civilization throughout all of history, that people live in daily reality, and yet they are aware of things that don't fit that reality.
Yeah, definitely. So in terms of some of his cases, I know this one wasn't an abduction. One of the most compelling for me was what happened at Ariel School. In Rua. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that one and John's involvement, but also if there's one that you think is maybe the most compelling, or that John thought was his kind of most compelling.
Well, let me talk about two. I mean, the first one, which predated John Mack, was Betty and Barney Hill.
Yeah,
this is the most famous abduction case in history. It happened in 1961 in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, but it didn't come out until more than 2 years later, because Betty and Barney Hill kept it secret. They were a couple that were driving home, and they saw what looked like a plane at first, and then a spaceship, and then the car stopped, and they saw these, the craft landed, and these beings abducted them, captured them, and took them into the ship for experiments. And Betty's dress was torn, and some of this they remembered consciously, which is another aspect of this that John Mack found interesting, that it's not all recoverable through hypnosis. Hypnosis being controversial itself, because we don't understand completely, how it works and what ideas can be implanted by a hypnotist. But so let's say some of these memories, at least, are conscious memories, which is another reason John Mack found them so compelling. So it was not all, recovered during hypnosis anyway. But in this case, the Betty and Barney Hill remembered some things, and then they didn't remember other things, and they ended up at home, and they didn't quite know how they got there. And later they had a lot of troubling dreams and went to a psychiatrist, a very eminent psychiatrist, not John Mack, who was not involved long before he got involved. This psychiatrist named Ben Simon, who was quite distinguished in his own right. He put them through hypnotic regressions and conscious interviews. And he too concluded that something had happened to them that he could not explain. Because in the regressions, they remembered, interactions with the beings. And I retell the story in my book. There's a book about the abduction itself. Anyway, so that's one case that is the gold standard, let's say, of abduction cases, which to this day have not been explained. And then, as you mentioned, the Ariel School was very interesting. While John was under investigation at Harvard, he heard about a apparent landing of a UFO at a school outside Harare, Zimbabwe, in southern Africa, where 60 children were at recess in the schoolyard, and they saw bright lights, balls of light, and a craft landing, and two small beings come out, and they looked at the kids, and the kids looked at them, and the children described them later as very short in some kind of uniform, kid-sized beings with mesmerizing black eyes that seemed to send telepathic messages, which is another feature of these beings, according to other accounts. And 60 children at least saw this and went, running to the adults who were quite surprisingly not present at the time. They were all doing other things. It was recess. The children later drew pictures of this. Anyway, John Mack rushed to the school, the Ariel School, interviewed the children. It's on tape, a lot of the interviews, and asked them just to describe their experiences. And these kids, again, who had not been readers of UFO literature and they'd not been steeped in movies, they were 10, 11, 12 years old, mixed race children, white, black, all variations, very diverse group of well-spoken children, told what they had seen. And what I just said, they saw these beings and they heard their messages in their heads, take better care of the planet. And the children got the feeling that there was something sad about these beings. And they felt almost a love. The children felt some kind of love for these creatures in some way, which we've seen in other cases. Anyway, and John Mack captured all this on tape and in interviews and video. There's a film going to come out at some point on this. It's been mentioned in other articles and books. I give a pretty full account in my book. So John Mack was very good with children, particularly because he'd written about childhood psychology. He'd spent a lot of time with children. He'd even spent time sort of investigating the development of his own three boys. And he really brought his knowledge home. He studied their interactions and their rivalries. So again, he was writing about something he knew well, and you could see him in the videos literally getting down on the floor with the kids to meet them at eye level and talk to them. And he was not leading them in any way, tell me about the time you saw the alien. He would say open-ended questions like, well, what did you see? And what did you feel? And what did this being say to you? Or what message did you feel you were getting? He was very non-judgmental. You could get that sense from the tape. It's very convincing. And again, what made this case, first of all, it happened in modern times. It happened in 1995 or 6, I believe, with all the modern technology of videotape and audio tape and all that. It's there for anyone to look at. You can look at a lot of them are online. The John Mack Institute, put them up. As I said, there's a film coming out, the Ariel phenomenon, by one of the experiences John Mack worked with, Randy Nickerson. So that is another famous. So we talked about two famous cases now: the Betty and Barney Hill case, where there's no video or audio. There's only records of their testimony, both conscious and under hypnosis, and now the Ariel School case. There are no videos of aliens that I know of landing. The phenomenon has not been captured to that extent, unlike UFOs, by the way.
Yeah.
Which there are pictures, good pictures. So that's an area that remains to be explored.
Yeah, it is a really compelling one, that Ariel School. I guess the average person who's skeptical and wants to look at that story and say, nah, I think they're probably going to say mass hallucination or mass hysteria, right? I'm assuming John looked into all that kind of thing and gave his best conclusion based on what he knew.
Well, yes, he did actually. And the way the children describe this, if you look at the interviews or so, they're very sober and they're very analytical, the children, and very matter of fact. And you certainly don't get the impression that this is a case of mass hysteria where children are all repeating the same story. The children are very thoughtful, and they're just repeating what they saw and what they heard. What they think they saw and what they think they heard, if you want to be very literal about it. But I think you come away from that, if you look at the videos or so, saying, well, it's very convincing. It's very hard to debunk. Anything, of course, is possible. The children could be, they're not really children, they're robots, instructed to say, you can come up with any theory you want, but it's got to fit the facts. And the fact is that this was a normal school, and this strange thing happened, which nobody can really explain. So it's quite compelling.
Yeah, definitely. Were there any other cases that you think John kind of hung his hat on?
Wow. Well, there was one case, by the way, that I spent some time talking about in my book, that, in this field, you think you've heard one case that is completely mind-blowing, and then you hear about another case, and that's even more mind-blowing. And that, so each case sort of resets the standard. And Bud Hopkins, at a conference, by the way, John Mack attended a number of very learned scientific congresses that dealt with this subject, one of which was at MIT in 1992. And that drew, and that's how I begin my book. That conference that MIT did not sponsor, it just provided a venue, but it drew atomic scientists and psychiatrists and theologians and religious scholars and, a broad section of experts, all grappling with this mystery of what was going on with these people. So, at this conference, Bud Hopkins also attended, and he made reference to a case he was investigating called the Brooklyn Bridge abduction of a woman who came to him and claimed that she had been taken by a spaceship with aliens from her 12-story window overlooking the Brooklyn Bridge in New York. And that there were witnesses to the case. Cars stopped outside on the bridge, and this UFO took her in and flew away and then plunged into the East River. That was the story from witnesses. And which is interesting, because now when we get around to talking about the UAP accounts and the investigation, some of them mention these craft objects operating in the water.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. They said the medium, it seems to be a trans-medium phenomenon, whatever it is. So it operates in the sky and the water. Anyway, this account said that the ship that took in this woman and 3 aliens from her window went into the river, the East River. John Mack was really taken with this case that Bud Hopkins was investigating, later wrote a book about. The problem is that the story kind of ends in a dead end, because the 2 people who came forward originally to tell Bud Hopkins about it could never be found. Bud Hopkins made contact with them, received messages from them, received audio messages, received written messages, but never found them physically to corroborate their story. So it ended in a real mystery, tantalizing, because there's so much that was, strange about that case. And yet Bud Hopkins thought this would be the case that would make his reputation, and that would be, the most famous abduction case of all history. And of course, in the end, you couldn't settle it like so many of the other cases. You can't settle these things. There's always some missing piece. And the proof that, skeptics keep asking for, show me an ashtray from a UFO. Show me a video of an abduction. It doesn't happen. I mean, people set up cameras in their bedrooms to try to capture it. It doesn't happen. The whole story of Skinwalker Ranch, where all these strange things were going on in Utah. The most important things that were observed by witnesses there did not make it to videotape, to the camera. So, you could say, well, it shows it didn't happen. But I think it's more complicated than that.
Yeah, I think so. And I think a lot of other people thought the same when, based on John's research. And one person that took an interest that I'm very interested in asking you about is the fact that Dalai Lama, when he reached out to John or through people to John and asked him to come and basically give him a briefing, right? A few days talking about this subject and his findings.
I'm very proud of having in my book, The Believer, that and because the story has never been told before. The Dalai Lama, being in exile from China, living in India, is very sensitive to political pressure, let's say, from the Chinese. He's a persona non grata in China, for sure. And yet he has a huge following, as we know, and he's taken as a renowned spiritual leader. But this was not a story that he necessarily promoted. So what happened is a filmmaker who had done some work with Tibetan Buddhists got an invitation to recruit a group of American researchers studying spiritual matters like alien abduction, and bring them to the Dalai Lama for a week of discussions, and he picked John Mack among them. So in 1992, Mack went off and met with the Dalai Lama and these other people, and they all told stories about what they were researching, including alien abduction. And the Dalai Lama, by the transcripts I was able to get, which was supposedly secret, but John Mack kept a copy, showed that it was no big revelation to the Dalai Lama. He was very familiar with spiritual things happening and unexplainable things in another dimension. And he was intrigued by the research that John Mack and others had done in alien abduction, but he wasn't really surprised. But just his reaction, he spoke pretty good English, so it's all in English. And I tell the story in my book.
Yeah, I thought it was just amazing that the fact that he invited him along. I mean, most people that don't really investigate this kind of, this topic and look into it, look past the veil, as it were. I don't think many people would assume that this kind of thing would happen, that somebody like the Dalai Lama would invite people researching alien abductions to come and talk about.
The fact that in retrospect, you'd say, well, sure, he'd be interested. I mean, he's a spiritual man and he's into different things, but it is a controversial topic, alien abduction, and there's a ridicule factor that anybody who gets into it has to deal with that in some way or other. And I think that's why they kept it kind of quiet. But I got the transcripts. Yeah,
it was an incredible find. So on that, you mentioned that, the Dalai Lama is obviously very spiritual and has that kind of way of looking at it. Let's have go down that road in terms of John Mack's changing. I won't say that he had a hard view on it and it changed to another hard view on it, but it was constantly evolving and, slightly changing, I suppose, his way of looking at this phenomenon or this thing that was happening. And I guess at some points he did think maybe it was more on potentially on a spiritual plane or something like that, and maybe not necessarily entirely in our physical reality. Yeah.
Well, when he heard about it from Bud Hopkins was very attached to the idea that this was a physical phenomenon happening in reality. And David Jacobs, a professor at Temple, who did some very good work in hypnotic regression of his own experiences, who was also a big factor in this field, he also felt, along with Bud, that this was something pretty much happening in reality, and that these aliens were bent on producing a hybrid race, and it was pretty evil stuff, actually, very traumatic and real, really essentially real. And John started questioning this increasingly and said, it's got to be happening in some other dimension that penetrates our dimension in a real way for the people experiencing it, but it's not necessarily happening in our everyday reality. And of course, that caused some strains with the experiencers he was dealing with, because they thought he was running out on them, weaseling out of the reality, because it was very real to them. And they kept saying, this is real, this really happened. So he couldn't quite decide in what reality this was happening. But what he brought to it, which is interesting, and this is what separated him from Bud Hopkins later, and they had a kind of a falling out over it, but they reconciled later, was that Mack was hearing from his experiencers that they felt transformed by the experience in some way, that they felt a kind of a love for the beings, that they felt the divine spark of the cosmos, and they felt they got a message to take better care of the planet because the planet was being destroyed by nuclear waste and by nuclear, weapons and by pollution, and that humans had to take better care of the planet, that these were the messages, the telepathic messages that experiencers felt that they were getting. So there was a transformative element to these experiences, that it was not just traumatic, it was traumatic, but not only traumatic, that they felt, these terrifying experiments performed on them and procedures and all that, the pregnancies removed, as they explained it. And but at the same time, it was not totally negative. They felt that they were being missionaries into a new, future, etc. And that differentiated Mack from Hopkins and Jacobs, and it caused him other problems because people thought he was projecting onto the experiences, that he wanted he wanted the experience to be transformative, and so it was, that he was imposing his own view on this whole strange business. But in the end, he thought it was not totally physical, that it was in some other reality, and he moved on to other things. He started seeing abduction as related to other, paranormal or anomalous areas, such as crop circles, which he investigated in England, other mysterious phenomena like Bigfoot, and eventually near-death experiences. He got very interested in that. And plus, along the way, he got interested in a lot of stuff. He heard about this mineral, Moldavite, which supposedly has mysterious properties. It's identified with the Grail in literature, that it has, according to the stories, this mineral which comes from the Moldau region of Bohemia and Czechoslovakia, Germany, that this stone can move. It turns up in unexpected places. So he was very interested in that story, explored that. He got a piece of those little stones for himself to investigate. I did too, by the way. I ordered one, and so far it has stayed put.
After reading your book, I want to get one as well. I think you're going to have a bump in Moldavite sales.
Yeah. So he got interested in these other things, Mac. And as I said, especially towards the end of his life, survival of consciousness. And it looked as if he was ready for the next stage in his existence, which is, working from the other side, as he told people. It wasn't suicide to step in front of that rushing car in London, but in some ways he was open to a new experience, you could say. So that, like Lawrence, by the way, who was killed in a motorcycle accident, he also, as John Mack wrote, seemed to be ready for death in a way, because he had done so much in life that he couldn't duplicate Lawrence.
Yeah,
could never recapture that important part of his life. So anyway, he was interested in John was interested in a lot of stuff at the end of his life that goes way beyond alien abduction.
Yeah, definitely. And a lot of other really interesting subjects that need to have more light shone on them, I think. Just a quick question. Do you know if he ever looked into like lucid dreaming and that kind of thing? Did he ever go down that road?
He looked into a lot of aspects of dreaming and its connection to these episodes, because he was constantly being told that he didn't understand that these people were going through sleep paralysis, for example. And now there are aspects of sleep paralysis that coincide with the alien abduction experience, because a writer named David Hufford wrote a whole book on the terror that comes in the night, about the old hag syndrome. People, including Hufford himself, experienced the sensation that malignant, awful, evil beings would climb into their beds at night and try to strangle them. And it was a visceral thing. I mean, you could smell the evil of these beings. And as I say, Hufford, who was a noted scientist, social scientist himself, experienced this. So there were connections between alien abduction and things like, old hag syndrome, which seemed to occur during the moment at night when the victim was in a sleep-like state. Okay, and sleep paralysis mimics some of the accounts of people suffering alien abduction. They're paralyzed, they can't move, their partners beside them in bed are switched off and can't speak, can't react, can't be roused. So these were the experiences that there was this overlap between the old hag syndrome, let's say, and alien experiences, but they didn't only happen. But the alien experience didn't only happen at night; they happened in the daytime. People driving their cars, walking around. So people who explain it all as sleep paralysis or a nighttime phenomenon or a nightmare could not explain these other occurrences. If it's a night, you don't have nightmares when you're driving your car, down the road. You're suddenly having a nightmare. So that didn't explain it. So and Mack, who had studied nightmares, knew that. So there was some overlap. It is interesting. The old hag syndrome did seem to mimic some of the abduction accounts, but not all of them.
Yeah, that's the thing. It doesn't answer all the questions. But yeah, the reason I asked about lucid dreaming, I had somebody on this podcast a few weeks ago, and we went deep into that, and he's an expert lucid dreamer and on lucid dreaming, and he believes there's a lot of connection with consciousness and survival of consciousness and past lives and all these different things around lucid dreams. So I just wondered whether it had been something that John had looked at as well.
Yeah, he would because he looked at all the possibilities.
Yeah, exactly. That was immediately what I thought when I put these two together in my head. But if we can just, before we wrap up on John and get back to talking a bit more about the kind of the current state of UFOs and things before I leave you, I was just wondering on John, if we could go into the survival of consciousness and life after death a little bit more, and if you could just talk briefly about his looking into that and his findings after looking into that.
Towards the end of his life, John moved on from alien abduction only to other things. His scope of interest widened. He got very interested in crop circles, and he went to England, as I said, to investigate them. And he actually lay down in one of them and felt tremendous energy. And one of his aides who went with him was very skeptical and thought that she didn't feel it, and she thought that it was a sign of machinery around and that maybe someone had made these crop circles. But it seems that while some of the crop circles are man-made as hoaxes or whatever, others are not. So anyway, that he wrote about that. He was very taken with that, and then he got very interested in the case of a young woman who was very brilliant, who had some paranormal gifts of her own, ability to see things, did remote viewing, etc., who was studying, her name was Elizabeth Targ, who was studying the effects of distant prayer on AIDS patients. And she found that AIDS patients who were prayed for did better than those who were not prayed for. It was an interesting finding, and she got some heavy funding for that, and it was quite striking. And then, unfortunately, she developed the same kind of brain cancer that some of the people she was studying had, and she died from it. And John Mack was very close to her and her husband, she married when she took ill, and became aware that after she died, people were, her husband and other people were receiving messages from her even after she died. And he was planning a book on this. Very interesting accounts. And as I end my book with these episodes where John Mack, after he died, he was seen, or his spirit was seen by people, friends of his, who recounted connections to him and things he said. Very interesting. I put it at the end of the book because I did not want it to interfere with the credibility of the book. These are completely unverified, they're anecdotal accounts, but they come from people who knew John Mack well, and they said, this is what happened. I saw that, he came back to me like this and that. And one episode I talk about in the book, a woman he went to the crop circles with had a dream where John Mack came, after he died, he came out of a crowd and walked up to her and said, let's go to a restaurant. She said, you're dead. And he said, of course. And they went to a restaurant and they sat on a banquette, and he was wearing a short sleeve shirt and she was wearing a sleeveless blouse, and their arms touched, and she felt tremendous heat coming off his arms. And she said, John, you're burning me. And he said, that's so you'll know I'm real. That's the dream she had. Other people had similar dreams. So anyway, this was his latest obsession, you could say, passion, as I say in the book, survival of consciousness. And it's interesting, like everything else he did.
Yeah, a timely passion as well, like you say, because he died not long after kind of really getting into that one, didn't he, I suppose? Yeah, and lots of weird little things. I mean, I definitely wouldn't put it past John Mack to have come back and communicated with some of the people he knew, from what I know of him after your book.
I've been writing the book that I was getting downloads of information often during the night. Could be my brain working overtime, just wrestling with problems, or it could be some, information from the cosmos.
Yeah.
Put this in, put that in. I don't know. But, I'm not saying definitely. All I'm saying is I got a lot of good ideas at night, lying there, and suddenly things would pop into my mind. Like many scientific advances occur with just an idea popping into the mind of the scientist. This is a well-known phenomenon. It's not, methodical in every case where a scientist follows a list, a list of clues and then suddenly solves the mystery at the end of the path. Suddenly some solution will appear, and where that comes from is rather intriguing.
Yeah. Definitely. I think that's one of the reasons I find John Mack so fascinating, is for the man that knew so much, he was also so much more aware than most of us are how much we don't know. If you see what I'm trying to say there, he was very aware of our limitations, I guess, of what we can understand at the moment.
Absolutely.
But he understood at the same time that that's not the limitations and barriers we see are not necessarily where the real limitations and barriers are. yeah, absolutely amazing character. And thank you for writing such a great biography about him that allowed me to kind of get to know him a little bit. Before we jump in and talk a bit more about, UFOs and stuff now, and your stuff with the Times, is there anything else you want to say just about John to kind of wrap it up?
Very charismatic character, tall, imposing, cobalt eyes. He was magnetic to men and women. I mean, he attracted both in terms of supporters and followers. He was attracted to other women, which he often laid to his loss of his mother in childhood. His mother died of appendicitis when he was 8.5 months old. So he was searching his whole life for a missing, female figure, which led him to some romantic adventures during his marriage. But he was not a sneaky kind of guy. He just said, I feel attracted to other women. And he had some women who he worked with who helped him in his research. But he was in many ways, as I say at the end of the book, I regard him as a heroic figure because he was willing to explore controversial areas, risk his career. He was not intimidated. He could have walked away and said, this is not going to help me in my, professional life. This is too kooky. But he said, why wouldn't everybody be consumed by this? This is a real mystery, and it is a mystery. And he didn't solve it. I didn't solve it in the book, and it may never be solved, but it's out there.
Yeah. No, it's amazing. And it's a mystery that's linked to UFOs. It's kind of on the same spectrum, but it's at the same time, they're different, partly because it's so much of a leap for your average person to go from, okay, so UFOs and things are real, okay, but to being abductions is a whole other kettle of fish.
Absolutely.
But yeah, it's a massive leap, but it's still in the same sort of topic. So let's go on more onto that.
Okay.
And I guess if you want to nip back to maybe your first published UFO related article, because I think you definitely did some before the big one that everybody talks about, and that's probably going to go down in history as like, a culture changing moment maybe in the media. But anyway, start wherever you want to start and tell me a little bit about what went into all that.
Big piece I wrote. I mean, I've been working on the John Mack book at that time for quite a number of years, but in 2017, a colleague of mine, Leslie Kane, and I was off the Times by then, I was a freelancer, but she came to me with a story of a meeting in Washington, D.C. Around a secret Pentagon unit called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program that was tracking UFOs. And it was the first indication that the government didn't give up the search for UFOs with the Blue Book and the end of 1969, that they were still involved. So we presented that story to the New York Times and got a very good story out of it. The head of the program, Lou Elizondo, had just resigned because he wasn't getting enough government support, but that there was this secret unit in the government, the Pentagon, investigating UFOs. And there'd been a lot of incidents to investigate. There'd been a series of incidents off the California coast with the aircraft carrier Nimitz in 2004, and it turned out that there were other encounters similar of UFOs and Navy jets off the East Coast in 2014 and 2015 with the Theodore Roosevelt. So these were a matter of interest to the government, and nobody knew that. It wasn't public. So we broke that story in the Times, and then we interviewed a number of pilots who told of these encounters and things they saw. It made it put the story, squarely in the front of the news because here was a mainstream publication reporting this. It was all on the record. We had no unnamed sources and no, anonymous tipsters. So it was all names and important people with their affiliations. Harry Reid, former Senate Majority Leader. And so we told that story, and it's had a lot of effect.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's been subsequent articles that have come out since, right? That you've worked on again with the same colleagues.
Yes. Yeah, we followed that up with a number of other pieces. The last one reporting on briefings to congressional committees about possible recoveries of materials from UFOs. It's not, a lot of that information is classified. We could not get much. It's very closely held. We don't know very much about it, but it's at least congressional committees were told that research is going on into some of these materials for possible purposes of reverse engineering to see if we could duplicate the amazing aerodynamics of these objects. Again, nobody knows what they are. Nobody is saying that they are extraterrestrial, that they come from other planets, that they contain aliens, because that's way beyond the information available. So in the Times, we've been very careful to limit the discussion to the fact that these are unidentified objects, just what the word says, or unidentified aerial phenomena, as the new term says. The breakthrough, the important thing is that we now seem to know that they're physical and that they exist. They're not spiritual, they're not imaginary, they're not archetypes, spiritual things. They're actual physical things, but we don't know anything beyond that.
Yeah, beyond the fact that they just seem to be way beyond our capabilities, right. I guess, from
that, the question always comes up, well, could this be Chinese or Russian technology or even our own technology? And the answer we get from our sources is no. The Chinese and Russians don't have anything, as far as we know, that is this far advanced, that can appear and disappear and reach hypersonic speeds and operate underwater as well as in the skies. So, and we wouldn't be risking our own technology in our own airspace. So that seems to point to an extraterrestrial hypothesis, but no one is saying that.
No, exactly. Not quite yet. I mean, even if it was all terrestrial and all man-made, somehow it would still be absolutely, life-altering in the sense that this technology is so far ahead of what we've seen, at least from what I can tell and from what much cleverer people than me say.
Well, certainly. If another country on Earth, or the U.S. has this technology, that would, as you say, be mind-blowing, because we're doing things that nobody thought we could do in that case. But it does seem very hard to imagine that a secret like that would have been kept until now, and that given all the close encounters with Navy craft, that we would allow another, an earthly adversary to do that to us, or that we would be doing it to ourselves, is pretty hard to imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's easy to see some similarities between yourself and John in the sense that you've both had these amazing careers where you've traveled everywhere, you've been involved in some amazing things, and you're also in a subject that is not so widely and easily accepted, or it's becoming more so now. But I'm sure when you first kind of started dipping your toes into these waters, it was not quite so open.
That's true.
But anyway, I'd love to know a little bit about how the attitudes have changed from your point of view, at the New York Times, but if you don't want to go too into that specifically, also just in the kind of mainstream, it's that word mainstream, but the mainstream media.
Yeah, I mean, a lot more information out than when we started. It has become, an acceptable area of reporting. I'm not saying we did that single-handedly, but I think we moved the needle.
Definitely.
And I think that it's taken some of the ridicule factor off. Used to be, career ending if a Navy pilot or sailor said they saw these things. It meant a quick trip to the psychiatrist. Now personnel are being encouraged to come forward with these stories, so that's a big breakthrough. So I think the climate has shifted. I don't think we did it single-handedly, but I think we had a major part to play in that, and I'm proud of that. So we're waiting for more developments. We're watching. We're talking to our sources all the time to see where it goes. It's not clear. This report is, as we record this interview, the report, a UAP report, is supposed to come out in June. I think there's a good chance it'll be delayed because there's so much to do, and it may not be ready in time for the 6-month deadline after the passage of the Defense Authorization Act last December. So it may not come out right in June. It may be delayed. Parts of it may be classified. only parts of it will be public. And a lot of questions about it, but so I'm not making any assumptions that there'll be a big disclosure, coming within a matter of weeks from this interview now, but we'll see.
Do you have any expectations or things like that that you feel comfortable to say now? I'm sure you've got your own private expectations, but anything that you would feel comfortable to share?
I don't feel comfortable speculating. I don't think, we're talking to people all the time for what might be in the report. People are very hungry for details, want to know how much does the government really know. Obviously, not everything has been put out. The 3 Navy videos that we put out in our reporting have been extremely popular. They show up every time, anybody reports on the phenomenon. And there's many more videos. We know that. There's longer parts of the videos that we did show that have not been released. A lot of it is held back. Some of it is classified, some not classified, but still not public. So
one of the most amazing ones recently, I think, that I saw was that object, or it seems like I don't know if it's a craft or whatever, but this thing you see is flying along above the water, goes into the water, comes back out, splits into 2, I think. And then I can't even remember whether it just zips off or goes back under. But
videos that have been taken, some have been authenticated by the government, not all of them. But then nobody knows what they are.
Yeah. I expect that water is going to feature in this report, because there's been a lot of at least rumor and a lot of smoke around that concept that, like we said earlier.
So, one of the pilots we interviewed saw a disturbance in the water. So clearly there's something to do with, underwater capabilities. But more than that, we don't know.
Yeah. There's a lot going on that needs to be figured out. Anyway, let me ask you one last thing, because I am conscious of the time. So one thing I like to ask all my guests is just if you could pass on a message to anybody that's listening and or watching, what would you say?
Listen, keep an open mind. Charles Fort, the great anomalist, great hero of mine, said, "Accept only temporarily." That was his phrase. So he also said he compared this field to looking for a needle no one ever lost in a haystack that never was. So keep your skepticism, keep your healthy disbelief, but be open. Be open to what people are bringing forth. And being a skeptic doesn't mean closing your eyes and ears to everything that doesn't seem possible. Of course, it's not possible. Everybody agrees it doesn't seem possible. And yet these accounts are hard to explain away. So just keep an open mind and see what comes. That's all.
Perfect. Love it. Thanks so much, Ralph. I really appreciate this. And again, thanks for writing about John Mack and bringing him to everyone's attention.
Okay, real pleasure. Thank you.
All the best. Thanks, Ralph.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to my conversation with Ralph Blumenthal. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Please give us and Ralph a follow on social media. If you'd like to know more about the wonderful John Mack, please follow the links in the description and get the book. I really recommend it. Thank you, Ralph, for giving me your time and for introducing me to the amazing John Mack. Be nice. Be happy. Be cool.